All right. Well, I guess let's go get more questions.
All right, let's do it. Let's go back over to the email over here, and this is kind of an interesting question. This is probably directed at Sam over here, says, what are some of the possible environmental disadvantages to a hydroelectric power source such as a dam? Everybody talks about hydroelectric power and how we need to use that, but what are some of the possible environmental disadvantages to using?
Absolutely. So really famous case studies of this are going to be like looking at the Hoover Dam or the Glen Canyon Dam along the Colorado River, two massive dams, particularly the Hoover. The hydroelectric power from the Hoover Dam provides a huge amount of the electricity. I don't know the percentage, but it's a large amount of the electricity to Las Vegas, the city. And hydroelectric power is really fantastic in a lot of ways. As long as a river is running, it really seems like, well, why wouldn't we just dam up the river and use that force to turn a turbine and create electricity? The major environmental impacts essentially come from the way that damming up the river changes the environment, or the living environment for the different organisms that might be in that location. So for example, the very obvious thing is when you dam up a river, you're going to flood a huge section of valley or canyon. The Three Gorges Dam in China is another really famous example of this in China. It's another one to look into. So the first thing you might think about is, okay, so water is just going to cover a massive expanse of land that was once exposed. So anything living, any land-dwelling creatures, organisms living in that area are going to be drowned or going to lose their ecosystem. From a human perspective, like when they flooded the area for the Glen Canyon Dam and created Lake Powell, they destroyed a settlement town called Haight in Utah. And obviously they told the people of Haight evacuated, but it was a town, it was a home to some people, and they were essentially told, you got to get out of here, we're going to flood the dam. From a personal perspective, there's a lot of beautiful, wonderful hiking that was destroyed when the dams went in. But there are really big, long-lasting environmental impacts of damming rivers also. So put aside all the immediate impacts of just flooding an area. There's a couple big things that happen. So one is rivers act as movers of earth from a continent to an ocean. So while we maybe don't think about it because it's not so obvious because you don't see it happening quickly, rivers are essentially used to take mountains and break them down and carry all the rock in the river out to the oceans. Over time, what would happen is silt would naturally be transported downstream, and you would have, like the rivers in the Rocky Mountains are essentially emptying out rock from the Rocky Mountains and flattening slowly the Rocky Mountains. And stopping that essentially stops sort of the natural river formation downstream, can prevent natural silt deposition that should happen downstream that might do things like for example, create land in a river delta. And then you also have issues with the temperature of the water. So like if a river is flowing without a dam, it may be a particular temperature, whatever it is, and the fish and the different organisms that live in that water are used to that temperature, and it's fairly consistent as it moves down the river. Now you dam the river in one place, and what you're going to do, you're going to stop a bunch of water in a lake. And the water at the top of the lake is going to be slightly warmer than the water at the bottom of the lake, but you're typically going to be letting water out of the bottom of the lake into the river, and so you're going to be letting this freezing cold water out of the bottom of the lake. So like this happens on the Colorado River, the water that comes out from below the Glen Canyon or the Hoover Dam is much colder than it would naturally be if the river was just allowed to flow, which has massive impacts on fish populations, insect populations, bacterial populations, plant populations downstream. And then this is all not to mention just the keeping of water from people and organisms downstream. So if there are people and organisms downstream that were planning on using that water, suddenly they have less access to it because you're restricting it. And this gets into big political and national questions about, is it ethical for the United States, for example, to hold a lot of our water before allowing it to flow downstream? So long-winded way to say there's a lot of different environmental impacts, and it sort of depends on maybe the angle that you're looking at. If you're going to talk about this in an environmental science class, you might identify a particular organism or area or population or community and ask how are they affected by the damming of the river.